Alrighty, back yet again, Fossil Creek classes. As always, my name is Jackson, retail manager over here at the store, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, bunch of bulbs, corms, tubers, and anybody know the last one there? Rhizomes, very important as well. So, the main part and the main focus of this class is to distinguish between all those, again, bulbs, tubers, corms, rhizomes, talk about what they are, why they're important, when to plant certain things, and what can be achieved from this. So let us start with the distinguishing factors between these four categories. To start, I would like to distinguish between what is a bulb, tuber, corm, rhizome, these underground storage structures from just general roots. So things like your trees and shrubs, perennials, things that will come back year to year, not due to these underground storage structures, but because of this root zone or this wood or something that is holding energy in its place. Now, in temperate parts of the world, as well as in tropical parts of the world, plants need to go through this ebb and flow, this wave of energy expenditure and energy saving in order to have really the most effective and efficient way of growing consistently year to year. There, of course, are annuals, which their job is to produce a fruit, flower, reproduce, and then seed over again. But everything that's going to be perennial, like some herbaceous stuff, again, these bulbs, tubers underground, trees, shrubs, are all going to be covered just by their roots and not necessarily by a structure that is storing all of their energy. Now, what does that look like? Well, a lot of your perennials, and I'm actually using a rhizome for this example, can't pull that out. Perennials, classic gallons like this, are going to have mostly these very big fibrous roots that are just all encompassing, and those will store energy from year to year, as well as hold a lot of energy kind of at the crown of your plant right here to produce foliage next season. However, we can now move towards those underground storage structures, again, bulbs, tubers, corms, rhizomes. So let's start with the one that everybody is the most familiar with as far as just common language, and that is bulbs. Now, all of these underground storage structures I'm talking about, including bulbs, are going to be modified stems. None of these are actually roots. This is not a root, it's not a leaf, this is a modified stem. Now, all of the ones I'm going to be talking about are modified stems. However, it's important to know that roots coming from these underground storage structures and the leaves coming from the top are merely just accents, just like on a shrub. The stem is connecting your leaf to your roots. So, starting with bulbs here, bulbs are a modified stem that, of course, grows underneath the ground. It has what's going to be important here. I'm going to use the word basal plate a couple times. Basal plate. Now, bulbs, true bulbs, will have a basal plate. Now, this basal plate is going to be one of the many ways to figure out whether you're dealing with a bulb, corm, tuber, or rhizome, but it is going to be important that this is present. The other one that will have this is, of course, going to be some of our corms, which I will discuss here in a second. But the other way to distinguish a bulb from our other underground storage structures is what is inside. Now, this may not be the best way to figure things out, especially if you don't want to damage it and you're planting it. And I don't really want to rip this one open here today. I wish I brought my lucky onion in, like usual. But anyway, I have this guy here. What we're going to do is if I took a cross section and I cut that open, which I would actually want to do now, but if I rip this open, did a cross section, you will find that there are actually modified leaves inside of this bulb. Now, these are going to be kind of closing in like that. If you ever open an onion, you'll see all those folds, those fleshy leaves that are providing storage structures. Now, in that respect, this is actually more like a leaf than a stem, but it is still important to know that the leaves inside here, the ones that are essentially holding that energy and keeping your sugars high, are going to be one of the best ways to distinguish it, because the only other storage structure that has those, again, collapsed and fleshy leaves inside that are holding storage are going to be some of your corms, but some of your corms but they will not be as prevalent in those. So again, bulb has the basal plate, true bulbs, basal plate. It has those collapsed leaves inside, storage structure. Another way that these will spread and grow is not through this root zone here, but as we start to grow out and get more energy into this bulb, it'll produce what's called bulblets on the right along the basal plate side there. And these will start out small, looking exactly like the bulbs, and they will continue to spread that way from year to year. Now, this right here is an allium. It's a type of ornamental onion. However, there are going to be many different types of onion ornamental eating that will go into that true bulb category. Again, basal plate, collapsed leaves, and little bulblets is going to be how it reproduces and spreads. Now, onions are just one example of this. Another great example of true bulbs are going to be daffodils. Now, all these are going to be bagged up, but I will kind of show you. Got that basal plate right there. Again, bulbs coming from the top. If I were to cut this open, you'd see those collapsed leaves inside, daffodils, and we have a ton of bulbs in right now that are true bulbs, but daffodils are a great one. We also have our tulips. Tulips are another true bulb. Again, basal plate there, and a little cone shape at the top. That's where that foliage is going to come from. And then finally, great example, is really actually Colorado Proud. Nice. Last example of our true bulbs that I have here is going to be hyacinth. Hyacinth, another really good one. Again, that basal plate there. Point at the top, the leaves are coming in. Storage structures. Now, these underground storage structures, these bulbs, corms, tubers, what have you, are going to be important because they don't have wood or any fibrous root zone that they're storing energy in. They're purely gathering energy from their foliage to send down to the bulb to use at a later time. Again, that ebb and flow, that wave of plants using energy and then saving energy to use later on. Now, the next one I'd like to talk about, very similar to tubers, are going to be corms. Pull up one of these here now. Corms are the only other underground storage structure I'll talk about here today that are going to have that basal plate. Again, basal plate is where all the roots are coming from, tops where all those leaves are going to be coming from. This one, if I were to cut this open and cross-section it, would not be as prevalent with those underground storage structures, those leaves. That are, again, collapsed in on themselves like you would see in an onion. It's going to be more just dense and compact in there. Less scales, as you can call it, that I can break apart. And just like with true bulbs, corms, like this crocus here, are also going to be spreading from those little kind of bulblets. However, they're a little bit different in that theirs are going to be a little bit more prevalent. But as far as two things being very similar go, corms and bulbs can be very similar. Bulbs generally will take on a more uniform shape due to those, again, compressed scales and modified leaves inside. And the corms will do the same, but they are generally more dense. Sometimes size is not going to be extremely important when distinguishing between these, but corms can be a little bit smaller sometimes. But the whole point of the corms and the bulbs is, again, they have a very easy to tell directional interface. You can see that base top there. Again, same thing with these tulips. They're all cone shaped, so we have base top there, base top there. It's going to be really helpful to tell us the difference. Corms may be a little bit more difficult to tell, but again, they'll still have that basal plate, what's going into the ground first, and then those tips, which of course the foliage will come from. Great. I want to talk about care in a little bit. Let's move on to another category. We'll talk about tubers. Now, tubers, the best way to describe this one, and I actually don't have one with me, along with my lucky onion. I left my lucky potato at home as well. But if you do have a potato handy, go ahead and chop it in half. You have yourself a tuber. Tubers are, again, going to be another modified stem that is underneath the ground. But unlike some of these corms and bulbs, tubers are going to be completely dense and full. There's going to be no scales, no distinguishing between different parts inside the bulb. There's not going to be any layers to those. They're just going to be a solid mass of sugar that is used again for the storage and ultimate use of a lot of your foliage later on. Now again, these bulbs are going to be modified stems, so they themselves are not a root. They grow roots from them, just like a stem on a perennial or shrub or tree would, and they're growing leaves from them, like, again, you would see on a regular stem. These ones are just displaced, let's say. But it is going to be really important to know the difference, just because people like to say this whole bulb over-encompassing category. But just like I said, with that potato, you cut it in half, it's drastically different, and you're planting it differently. Another great thing about a lot of your tubers, again, with that mass and dense, essentially gathering of sugars and storage and energy inside of it, is going to be that tubers can be cut up into multiple sizes. They can be cut up into multiple shapes. They have a very specific characteristic where you need to have an eye associated with that. Again, that is a point from the stem where leaves are going to be growing, or roots for that matter. But it is also going to be important to know the difference, because you can cut up tubers and propagate them that way, but I can't do the same with this bulb. I can't cut this bulb in half and make more, not like you could with, say, like garlic or something. But another great reason, tubers, potatoes are going to be one of the most classic ways to describe those. Now, finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about rhizomes. Rhizomes are going to be another one of our underground modified stems, one of those storage structures. How much do these bags of bulbs run? They are right around $9 to $10 for some of these guys. I have larger ones, which will be a little bit more expensive, but any of these bulbs in these packages here run about $8 to $9. Back to those rhizomes. One of the classic examples is going to be iris, but not only is a rhizome an underground storage structure modified stem, but it is also going to be growing horizontally. So its directional influence is not as affected when planting as something like a bulb or a corm would be. Again, those underground storage structures for rhizomes. Here's an iris. It's very pretty, I'm sure. It's just not coming right now. But you can even see there's indents in the pot here. And that is from those underground rhizomes trying to grow like they want to horizontally and spread out that way. And from those modified stems, roots, shoots coming up and down. But harder to grow in pots like this, or really constricted in tight spaces, just because of those horizontally growing structures. Ginger is going to be another great example of that. And let's see, as far as rhizomes go, cannas are also going to be a big one. You may have seen these or had some of these cannas in an annual display or seen them this year. Well, taking a look at the pot here, it's a little bit beat up, it's a little bit warped, and again, that is the rhizome of this canna lily trying to grow horizontally out. Again, rhizomes are not as affected as much with direction when you are planting them, although it's good to know where things are coming from. But they're not going to be as clear as those bulbs or corms, because those, of course, are going to have that basal plate. Again, basal plate, you'll see the kind of dried up roots when you go to purchase those or go to plant those. So that's the main distinguisher between all of these. There are different plants that need to be planted and cared for at different times. For example, let's take some of our true bulbs into consideration. This is going to, of course, be our daffodils. These guys, you're going to be, for the most part, planting in the fall. And that is because a lot of these bulbs, a lot of these corms, tubers, what have you, will require a dormancy period. Not only a dormancy period with the lack of light and water, but they'll also require a cold period. Now, plants that require either something damaged or something temperature-wise to grow or start growing or go in dormancy, that is called, at least for temperature, a stratification requirement, meaning that this bulb here needs to experience a certain amount of cold before it can even think about pushing out more leaves, and that is its defense mechanism and its wave, its ebb and flow of being able to conserve and use energy at the right times. Would you plant these around a front yard tree altogether? Sorry, I'm answering some questions over here. Would you plant these around a front yard tree altogether? You absolutely can. Bulbs, for the most part, will, again, because they're not storing energy in fibrous root zones or wood, most of their energy is going to be stored in the bulb. Therefore, they will have very superficial roots, which is why a lot of people will plant them in their turf grass. They will also plant them right around trees, as this question is mentioning here, because those superficial roots don't really affect or compete with the fully grown tree in that area. So you absolutely can, and you can plant them all together. Just be careful if you're doing something rhizomatous, like a canna, that it may not survive the winter. And if you're doing rhizomatous things like a iris, again, with how vigorous some of these rhizomes can be, that's another reason why it's important to distinguish, because these will be less capable and less suitable growing next to a big tree. It could compete a little bit more, or the tree itself could impede how much these guys are growing. So with the exception of some of your rhizomes, I would say absolutely you can plant them next to your big front yard tree. I'm glad you love the videos. Let's see here. Fantastic. Back to it. So, care. We're talking about that stratification requirement, that cold requirement that some plants will need in order to do something. That is why when you see all these full bulbs, and you can't quite see them, but they are right over there. I have a big rack full of all of these wonderful Netherland bulbs, but all the ones that you're planting right now will require that cold period to know when to break dormancy, to start using their stored energy and to produce flowers and ultimately leaves. Now, once you put them in the ground in the spring, of course, in the fall, my apologies. Once you put them in the ground in the fall, what you'll notice is in the spring, they will pop up. A lot of them will be very early blooming. They're very tolerant and hardy to cold temperatures. And after they're done blooming, they will just have foliage. Now, this foliage on its own will start to die off a little bit once we get into hotter seasons, closer to the summer. But it's also important to know that if they're not dying back, they keep putting out more green foliage or doing great, leave it for a while. Because what you're ultimately going to do, that foliage is what's going to capture, take that energy, and then store it back down into that underground storage structure, bulb, tuber, corm, what have you. So it's important to know that you want to keep that foliage up for a while, especially if you're going to keep those bulbs in the ground. If you want to take them out and move them, or if you just want to replenish that because after a couple of years they haven't been doing as well, that's fine. But if you have a tuber, corm, rhizome, what have you, that is putting off a lot of green foliage, is looking great, I would wait until later in the summer to early fall to really start chopping that down. And once you do chop down that foliage, once I give it a good cut, all the energy that it's been providing is going to go right into that bulb, back into storage to be used next year, or the next season for that matter. There are tropical ones. I keep bringing up this canna here, which is a very great annual. Of course, this is very similar, though. I could chop this back, store in a cool and dark place these rhizomes in here, and use them in my annual baskets next year. Harder to do with tropical plants because you can't really let them freeze, and you need to create a pretty good environment for them to maintain or be at. Alrighty, so that has to do with planting bulbs in the fall for spring. Again, big trees in the front yard, people put them in their turf grass, they'll put them in their beds, and once they're done blooming, they will pretty much just photosynthesize and get out-competed by your other plants, which are growing for that season. So after that, there are also spring bulbs. Now these bulbs are going to be very similar to my friend Canna here, in which any bulb that you purchase in the spring and plant, some of those will be tropical, some of those will actually be hardy, but I would treat any bulb you plant in the spring as an annual. You are planting it in the ground to provide showy flowers throughout the summer, into the summer, late summer, whatever you have, and I would not expect those to come back year to year as much, just because those ones are more specialty in the spring. They're used mostly for production throughout the season and not to be overwintered to next year. So you can buy bulbs 2 times a year. Of course, you can buy perennials like iris or allium at any time and plant it and it'd be just fine, but they're going to act more independently than something that's more specialized and purchased in a bulb. And what I mean by that are a lot of these perennials that you see at the garden center that are sold in these black nursery pots are going to be ones that will pretty much be self-sufficient. You only have to cut back with your other perennials. So we talked about the distinguishing factors between all of these. We talked a little bit about kind of what the care for all these is going to be and when to plant them, what you're doing at what times of years and when to plant them. The one thing I'd like to add after all of this is the future fertilization supplemental care of these underground storage structures are going to be fertilizer. Now, because all of their energy is stored in such a fleshy little mass like this, they can be very sensitive. So using synthetic fertilizers, tree and shrubs, or using something that's a water-soluble, a granular, is maybe not the best idea. There are specific fertilizers I will use with quotations because they don't have very much in them, like bulb tone. Anything that's labeled for bulbs, bulb tone is a Spoma product. I think High Yield has one as well. But that is something that you plant with the bulb. Keeps it nice and dry. It's a slow release. There's not a lot of salt, so you're not burning that very fleshy and tender skin and epidermis of the bulb itself. But you're still providing nutrient to be broken down and for the bulb to use throughout the season. Because once you put this bulb in the ground and it blooms, it's going to need to recollect a lot of energy, and that can be done by letting those leaves grow out like we talked about, or even additionally fertilizing with a little bit of bulb tone upon planting, and if you wanted to replant later, do that again, or you could top dress with something like that in those areas. But it's just going to be important to know that most of these are going to be carefree. Most of these bulbs. If I were to plant these daffodils in the ground right now, I would really not want to do a whole lot of supplemental watering or work to them. We, especially here in our clay soils, see some bulbs rot out due to the immense amount of water that lingers and is stagnant in the ground. And we will also not want to, plant them too high, too low. Most bulbs will have a chart about that. And as long as you plant a little bit of bulb tone, cover them up, let them be, you will see those wonderfully in the spring. Now, covered the bulbs, covered a little bit of care, covered what we can do as far as maintaining. Does anybody have any more questions? Anybody want any examples? Because I wanted to make this a little bit more concise, just to be very clear about things and kind of teach a little bit about what's going on here. I don't want to get too into depth about anything, but again, any questions before I wrap up here? I'll just wait a good second. Do they require full sun? That's a fantastic question. Most bulbs will want full sun, not only because of the foliage and flower necessary, but the more sun that you get in a place, the more, of course, that the soil is going to dry out. It's going to evaporate. It's going to transpire. So the more sun you can put your bulbs in, the more flowers you'll have, the happier the leaves will be, and you don't have to worry about them rotting out in the winter when snow is covering areas and keeping things extremely wet. So great question there. Any other questions that we got? Well, alrighty. Thank you, everybody, for joining our short little class here. And again, this was Jackson. I hope you have a wonderful day. So wouldn't the tree give them too much shade? Actually, well, no, the tree is going to, it depends how closely you put them underneath the tree, but that's why a lot of people with big trees will replace their bulbs from year to year, just because when they're like this from the bag, they have their full potential of energy. So you plant them there, they'll pop up, and a lot of times people will dig those out. Or if they can limb up their tree to give enough light underneath to provide for those bulbs, they can as well. But if you're planting them underneath the tree, try it for a couple years. You just may need to replace them more frequently. All right. Thank you. All righty. Thanks, guys.